We've all been there. You're in a team meeting, and the most senior person in the room is talking about the importance of being authentic with each other, bringing your whole self to work, being vulnerable about what you're really thinking. And while they're saying it, something in the room doesn't quite fit. The words are right and the values are real, but the way they're landing isn't the way words are meant to land. Something feels off. Most leaders have been in a meeting like this. The language of authenticity gets used, but the practice doesn't follow. This episode is about that gap, the growing distance between what we call authentic leadership and what authentic leadership actually requires. Welcome to The Threshold, where we say the quiet part of leadership out loud. A show about the space between who you were and who the role asks you to be. I'm Amanda Ramplin. There's a growing critique of authentic leadership that's been showing up in research and commentary over the last few years. So the argument is that being authentic doesn't actually make leaders more effective. That the leaders who emerge as authentic are often charismatic or narcissistic rather than self-aware. And that be yourself advice has produced more problems than it's solved. I want to take this critique seriously because I think it's pointing at something real. There is a problem with how authenticity has been working in corporate culture. We've all seen the patterns the critics are describing. The performed vulnerability, the asymmetric disclosure. The leader who uses, "I'm just being authentic," as a defense against accountability. But I don't think the critics are right about what's broken. The leaders they're describing aren't failing because they're authentic. They're failing because what they're doing isn't actually authentic. It's impression management with authenticity language painted over it. These are two different things. So today I want to walk through both. What weaponized authenticity actually looks like and how it became this confusing thing. And then what real authentic leadership requires and what we see when leaders actually do it. Let me name a few patterns I've seen across the rooms I've been in over the years. I'm sure some of these will sound familiar. The first is what I'd call asymmetric vulnerability. This is the leader who uses authenticity language to ask others to disclose more than they're comfortable with while maintaining their own professional reserve. "I want us to be authentic with each other," said by the most senior person in the room, creating pressure on junior people to share. Then the leader doesn't reciprocate. Or reciprocates only with carefully managed disclosures that have been workshopped to land a particular way. The team can feel the asymmetry. They're being asked to be vulnerable in a space where vulnerability flows in one direction. And that's not authentic. That's power using authenticity language as cover. The second is performed disclosure. This is a leader who shares something vulnerable in a town hall or a leadership offsite or maybe a team meeting. And you can tell the disclosure has been workshopped. The content might be real, but the delivery is performed. Everyone in the room can feel that it's been thought through, refined, possibly even rehearsed. What's interesting about performed disclosure is that the leader often doesn't know they're doing it. They believe they're being authentic. From their perspective, they're sharing something they wouldn't have shared a few years ago. But from the team's perspective, what's being shared has been managed so carefully that the vulnerability is gone by the time it arrives. The third is authenticity as defense. This is a leader who responds to challenge with, "I'm just being authentic." Whatever they've done, whatever they've said, the response to questioning is to invoke authenticity as a kind of shield. They're not defending the substance of what they did. They're defending the right to be themselves. This is one of the most common patterns I've seen. Authenticity as license. Whatever I say or do is authentic, therefore unquestionable. The conversation closes before it begins. The fourth is authenticity as strategy. So this is a leader who has studied vulnerability because the research suggests it builds trust and now deploys it instrumentally. They share a personal moment at the start of every keynote. They make a point of mentioning a challenge they're working through in every team meeting. The vulnerability is real in content, but it's strategic in function. This pattern is harder to spot than the others because it can look like good leadership practice. The leader is doing the thing the research says to do. What's missing is the underlying practice. The vulnerability has been studied, refined, and deployed. It hasn't been lived. And here's the thing the critics of authentic leadership keep missing. None of the patterns I've just described are actually authentic. They're all forms of impression management. The leader using asymmetric vulnerability is managing the impression of being open while protecting themselves. The leader performing disclosure is managing the impression of vulnerability while controlling exactly what gets revealed. The leader using authenticity as defense is managing the impression of integrity while avoiding the accountability that real integrity requires. And the leader deploying authenticity as strategy is managing the impression of being real while doing something deeply unreal. In each case, what looks like authenticity is something else wearing the word. This is where I think the growing critique has it half right and half wrong. It's right that something has gone wrong with how authenticity has been working in corporate culture. It's wrong about what's gone wrong. The problem isn't that leaders are being too authentic. It's that what gets called authenticity has been quietly replaced by something else. Something that uses the language of authenticity, but doesn't do the work of it. Real authenticity is more demanding than the critics realise. It's also more demanding than the leaders performing it realise. It's not be yourself in the casual sense. It's a specific practice that requires things most leaders haven't been asked to develop. Real authenticity requires you to actually know who you are before you can be authentic. Most of us are running on accumulated patterns, defensive habits, inherited beliefs about how to operate. Being authentic requires the work of distinguishing what's actually true from what we've been performing for so long it feels true. Real authenticity requires emotional regulation. You can't be authentic in a useful way if you can't manage your own internal state. Without that capacity, authenticity becomes reactivity wearing a label. Real authenticity requires consideration of others. Authentic doesn't mean unfiltered. It means honest in a way that serves the relationship and the work. Adapting how you communicate based on who you're talking to isn't inauthentic, it's emotionally intelligent. Refusing to adapt is just self-indulgence with a label on it. And real authenticity requires accepting the cost. There are moments when being authentic costs you something. Standing for what you actually believe in a meeting where the easier move would be to fold. Naming something true about a project that everyone else is avoiding. Holding your position when it would be more comfortable to soften. The leaders who are generally authentic do this. The leaders who are performing authenticity skip these moments because they're costly. See, authenticity that costs nothing isn't authenticity. It's just comfort. So what does it actually look like when a leader is doing the real work? I want to share 2 examples I've seen. Not famous leaders, just observations from rooms I've been in. And the specifics aren't the point. The point is what the practice looks like in action and what it produces. The first is a leader I observed during a difficult moment in their organisation. So the business was facing a significant problem, performance had dropped, and some of the strategic decisions of the previous year were being questioned. The board was concerned and the team were uncertain. Most leaders in that situation default to reassurance. They project confidence. They get out in front of the narrative. They tell the team things are under control. This leader did something different. In their first meeting after the situation became public, they stood up and said, in essence, here's what we know. Here's what we don't know. Here's where I think we went wrong. And here's what I'm committed to learning from this. Here's what I need from you to figure out what comes next. No reassurance, no projection of certainty, just an honest accounting of where they were. And here's what happened. The team didn't panic. In fact, the opposite. The room got steadier. People stopped speculating about what was being hidden because nothing was being hidden. The conversation moved from anxiety about the situation to focus on what could actually be done. Within months, the organisation had stabilised and was making the difficult changes they needed to make. The leader hadn't performed authenticity, they had been authentic. The cost was that they had to say things that they were uncomfortable to say. And the result was that the team trusted them in a way that they hadn't before. And the work moved forward. The second example is a leader I observed in a team meeting. A direct report had raised a concern about a decision the leader had made. The concern was substantive, and it cut against the direction the leader had been advocating. Most leaders in that moment would do one of two things. They would defend the decision and dismiss the concern, possibly framing the dismissal as being open to feedback while not actually changing anything. Or they would perform openness, thank the person for the input, and quietly proceed as planned. This leader did something different. They paused. They asked the direct report to walk them through the concern in more detail. And they engaged with it with more substance. They asked clarifying questions. And then at the end of the conversation, they said, "I think you're right. Let me think about what this means for what we've been planning." 2 weeks later, the direction had shifted. Not entirely, but the original concern had been integrated into the plan. Here's what I noticed about the team in the months that followed. The people started raising concerns. The quality of disagreement in the room increased. Decisions got better because they were being stress tested in real time rather than relitigated months later when something went wrong. The team's performance metrics improved. The leader didn't announce that they were modelling authentic leadership. They just did it. They were willing to be wrong in front of their team. They were willing to change their position. The willingness was the practice. The performance impact followed. These two examples are quite different in scale, a public crisis and a quiet team meeting. But what they have in common is that the leaders weren't performing authenticity. They were practicing it. And they were doing things that were costly to them personally because the situation required it. And in both cases, the practice produced real outcomes, steadier teams, better decisions, but importantly, genuine trust. See, this is what the critics of authentic leadership miss. They look at the performed version, the disclosure that's really strategy, the vulnerability that's really positioning, and they conclude the whole thing doesn't work. And I understand why. The performed version is everywhere, and it's easy to point out. But the performed version was never authenticity. It was always impression management wearing authenticity's language. Judging authentic leadership by that is like judging honesty by watching someone lie convincingly. The leaders who are actually doing this are harder to see. And that's part of the point. The CEO who gave an honest accounting in a crisis wasn't trying to be seen doing it. The leader who changed their position in the meeting wasn't performing openness for an audience. The work is quiet because it's real. There's no performance to notice. That's the part the critique can't account for. It can measure the leaders who are performing because performance is designed to be measured. It misses the ones who are practicing because practice doesn't announce itself. It just shows up in steadier teams and better decisions, and the kind of trust that takes years to build and can't be faked into existence. The work is happening. It's happening in ordinary rooms in moments no one is recording, and it's producing exactly the outcomes the critics say authentic leadership can't deliver. They're just not looking in the right place to see it. If you're at the threshold right now, here's a question I'd offer you. Are there times in your leadership you're using the language of authenticity to do the work of impression management? Or have you noticed it in leaders around you? This can be uncomfortable to ask. Most of us do it somewhere, the places we share vulnerability that has been managed, the moments we invoke being real to avoid accountability, the patterns we frame as authentic that are actually protective. And then a second question. What's the one place this week where you could practice the actual thing? Not perform it. Practice it. Say the harder thing in the room where you've been smoothing over it. Hold your position when it would be more comfortable to soften. Change your position when you've seen something you've missed. Just sit with it. That's episode 7 of The Threshold. Next time, we'll close out the first season with an episode called The Inner Game, about the difference between the outer game of leadership, the visible work everyone sees, and the inner game underneath it, the one that actually determines how we lead. I'll draw on the idea Tim Galway wrote about decades ago, and the question I think sits at the centre of this whole season. Are you willing to do the inner work that the outer work requires? If this episode landed, the most helpful thing you can do is share it with one person you know has been sitting with their own version of this question, about what real authenticity actually requires and what gets passed off as authentic in their world. If you haven't already, follow the show wherever you're listening, and if you have time, leave a review. It genuinely helps other leaders find this work. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.